The air in the north compound of Stalag Luft III hung thick with a peculiar mixture of boredom and electric tension. To the casual observer, it was a landscape of drab routine, morning roll call, meager meals, endless hours spent pacing the perimeter wire under the watchful eyes of the goons in their towers. But beneath this veneer of weary resignation, a secret war was being waged. Its general, a man whose quiet intensity could chill the blood, was Squadron Leader Roger Bushell. Captured after his Spitfire was shot down during the Dunkirk evacuation in May 1940, Bushell was a barrister by trade and a born leader by nature. Twice he had escaped from German captivity, and twice he had been recaptured, the last time by the Gestapo in Prague. He had seen their methods, felt their brutality, and survived. His experience had not broken him, it had forged him into a weapon of pure, cold resolve. He now walked the sandy soil of Sagan not as a defeated prisoner, but as a commander on a new front. His personal escape was no longer the goal. His vision, born from the Gestapo's interrogation rooms, was far grander, far more disruptive. He intended to tear a hole in the fabric of the Third Reich itself. Upon his arrival at Sagan in late 1942, he gathered the camp's most experienced escape artists into a covert committee. Under the code name Big X, Bushell laid out his master plan, a proposal of such staggering audacity that it left even the most hardened Kriegies breathless. This would not be another stealthy escape of 2 or 3 men. This would be an exodus. An earthquake. He declared his intention to organize an escape of 200 men in a single night, a feat never before attempted. The purpose was not merely freedom, but chaos. The only reason that God allowed us this bloody war, he told his inner circle, his voice low and menacing, is to give us the opportunity to annoy the Hun. 200 trained officers, fanning out across Germany, would trigger a manhunt of unprecedented scale, diverting thousands of German troops, police, and Gestapo agents from the front lines. It was, in his eyes, a sacred duty. And so, in the spring of 1943, the X organization was born, a ghost factory humming with forbidden purpose, right under the noses of their captors. Subscribe so you won't miss new stories, and feel free to ask questions in the comments. Your interest inspires us to discover new topics. The very ground upon which Stalag Luft III was built was the first and greatest obstacle. The camp sat on a loose, sandy soil, a geological feature the Germans had chosen with deliberate cunning. The fine, bright yellow sand was easy to dig, but it was dangerously prone to collapse. More importantly, its color was a stark contrast to the dark gray topsoil of the compound. A single misplaced handful could betray everything. Any prisoner disposing of it would be like a man bleeding on fresh snow. Yet, Bushell's plan required the excavation and disposal of hundreds of tons of the stuff. To achieve this, he decreed the simultaneous construction of not 1, but 3 tunnels, codenamed Tom, Dick, and Harry. The logic was brutally simple: if one was discovered, the others could continue. The workload would be immense, a logistical nightmare requiring the coordination of over 600 prisoners. The X organization was structured like a corporation of Defiance. At its head was Big X Bushell, the CEO of the enterprise. His chief engineer, the man tasked with the impossible, was a Canadian mining engineer and Spitfire pilot named Wally Floody, who became known as the Tunnel King. Floody's job was to design tunnels that could withstand the treacherous sand and stretch over 300 feet, 30 feet below the surface, beyond the perimeter fence and the listening microphones. The entrances were marvels of concealment. Tom began under a stove hearth in Hut 123. Dick was hidden beneath a drainage sump in the washrooms of Hut 122. And Harry, the most ambitious of all, was concealed under a heating stove in Hut 104. The digging itself was hellish work. Men, known as diggers, would lie on their backs in suffocatingly tight shafts, scraping away at the sandy face with improvised tools, trowels made from old food tins, chisels from bed frame bolts. The sand was packed into small bags, which were then hauled back to the entrance by penguins, men tasked with the perilous job of dispersal. The penguins would fill long, thin sacks made from socks or trousers, hide them inside their own pants, and then, with a stiff-legged, waddling gait that gave them their name, they would shuffle around the compound, releasing the yellow sand into the vegetable gardens, under the theater seats, or mixing it into the darker soil. Every day was a gamble, a tightrope walk between progress and discovery, with the ever-present German ferrets, guards specially trained to detect escape activity, sniffing for any clue, any wisp of bright yellow sand that would bring the entire operation crashing down. The engineering challenges of the tunnels were monumental. A shaft 30 feet deep and over 300 feet long could not survive on hope alone. Wally Floody and his team of diggers became masters of improvisation, turning the very fabric of their imprisonment into the tools of their liberation. The primary threat was collapse. To shore up the 2-foot by 2-foot tunnels, the prisoners systematically stole the wooden bedboards from under their own mattresses. It was a perilous theft. Each man was allocated 20 boards, but soon, nearly every bunk in the North Compound was precariously supported by just 8 or 9. By the end, over 4,000 boards had vanished into the earth. To move the sand more efficiently, they constructed small trolleys that ran on wooden rails. The trolleys were pulled by ropes made from braided towels and string from Red Cross parcels. But the most ingenious invention was the air circulation system. As the tunnels grew longer, the risk of oxygen deprivation and suffocation became acute. The diggers were fainting at the tunnel face. The solution was a pump designed by a brilliant Canadian pilot named Bob Large. Using a duffel bag, a hockey stick, a pair of suspenders, and, most importantly, empty Clem-powdered milk tins, he built a two-way bellows pump. Operated by a man near the entrance, this Clem pump pushed fresh air through a ventilation ducting, also made from interconnected Clem tins, all the way to the tunnel face, while simultaneously drawing out the stale air. It was a life-saving miracle of scrap heap engineering. Just as vital was lighting. The diggers worked in darkness until they managed to tap into the camp's own electrical grid. They brazenly spliced into the main cables, running a wire down the shaft to power a string of crude light bulbs, stolen or bartered from cooperative guards. The entire underground enterprise was protected by a sophisticated security network, run by Al Hake, the camp's security chief. His team of stooges was a complex web of lookouts. Men were posted at every corner of the hut, in the windows, and even outside, ready to give a coded signal, a cough, a book dropping, a certain tune whistled, at the first sign of an approaching ferret. The system was tested daily. On one terrifying afternoon in the summer of 1943, a German guard entered Hut 104 unexpectedly. Below, a team was working on Harry. The trapdoor was slammed shut, the stove replaced, and the men above scrambled to look nonchalant, their hearts hammering against their ribs. The German lingered, poked around, and then left, oblivious to the fact that 20 feet beneath his boots, a dozen men held their breath in the suffocating darkness, their secret still safe. While the diggers toiled in the subterranean darkness, a parallel industry flourished in the relative light of the barack huts. An escape tunnel was only the first step. Survival on the run in Nazi Germany required a new identity. This was the domain of the forgery department, codenamed Dean and Dawson after a popular British travel agency. Headed by the gifted artist and pilot, Flight Lieutenant Des Plunkett, this section was arguably the most intellectually demanding of the entire operation. Plunkett and his team of around 40 men set out to create near-perfect replicas of every document an escaper might need: identity cards, Ausweis, work permits, travel passes, and ration coupons. The raw materials were a forger's nightmare. They used pages from Bibles for certain types of paper, while others were sourced through bribery or theft from the Germans themselves. The detail was painstaking. They studied original documents, meticulously replicating the Gothic script, the official stamps, and the subtle watermarks. The stamps were carved from rubber boot heels. The ink was a carefully brewed concoction of soot, crushed berries, and other secret ingredients. Getting the photographs for the documents was a stroke of genius. A friendly German guard was bribed to provide film, and a prisoner with pre-war photography experience built a functional camera from a cardboard box and lenses from a salvaged pair of glasses. He would photograph the prospective escapers against a white sheet, develop the film using chemicals scrounged from the camp infirmary, and produce the tiny portraits needed for the IDs. Over 400 first-rate forgeries were produced. In concert with the forgers, the tailoring department worked its own magic. Led by a prisoner who had been a tailor in London's Savile Row, this team converted military uniforms into plausible civilian clothing. RAF blue was dyed with coffee grounds and boot polish to resemble the dark suits of foreign workers. Old blankets were cut and stitched into convincing overcoats. Every detail was considered, from the style of the buttons to the cut of the lapels, ensuring that the finished product would pass muster at a casual glance on a German train platform. These were not just tailors and forgers, they were illusionists, crafting new personas from thin air and stolen thread, giving the men who would crawl through the earth a fighting chance of seeing the sun rise on a free horizon. By the end of summer 1943, the tripartite operation was running at full tilt. Tom was the most advanced, its shaft snaking out towards the woods, nearly complete. Harry was progressing steadily, and Dick served as a useful workshop and storage area. The mood in the camp was one of nervous exhilaration. The machine that Bushell had built was functioning perfectly. Then, on September 8, 1943, disaster struck. The penguins had become slightly complacent, and a keen-eyed ferret noticed a patch of telltale yellow sand near the entrance of Hut 123. The Germans, who had been suspicious for weeks, swarmed the area. They knew a tunnel was nearby, but they couldn't find the entrance. They brought in probes, listening devices, and even tore up parts of the floor. For 2 agonizing days, the camp held its breath. Finally, a German guard, frustrated, threw a heavy tool against the stove. It shifted slightly, revealing the faintest crack of a hidden seam. The game was up. The Germans ripped open the trapdoor to Tom. A wave of triumphant elation swept through the German command, but also one of grudging admiration. They were astounded by what they found, a fully shored, electrically lit, and ventilated tunnel stretching nearly 300 feet. The Commandant, von Lindner-Wilda, a career Luftwaffe officer of the old school, was more impressed than angry. He invited prisoners from other compounds to tour the marvel of engineering before dynamiting its entrance. The discovery sent a shockwave of despair through the X-organization. All that work, all that risk, had come to nothing. Worse, the Germans now knew their methods. Security was massively increased. Roll calls became more frequent and unpredictable. The ferrets prowled with renewed vigor. For a time, it seemed Bushell's grand scheme was dead. He ordered all digging to cease. He instructed that the entrance to Dick be filled with sand and sealed, preserved for a future emergency but effectively abandoned. The focus, the hope, the entire weight of their audacious dream, now rested on one final, desperate chance, the tunnel hidden beneath the stove in Hut 104. The Great Escape was about to be reborn from the ashes of Tom, more determined and more desperate than ever. The name of that hope was Harry. The discovery of Tom was a body blow. For weeks, a funereal gloom settled over the North Compound. The Germans, smug in their victory, filled the shaft with sewage and sand before dynamiting the entrance, a final, odorous act of desecration. They increased their patrols, conducted snap inspections at all hours, and brought in fresh, more vigilant ferrets who viewed the prisoners not with the grudging respect of old soldiers, but with the cold suspicion of Gestapo functionaries. Any lesser man than Roger Bushell might have conceded defeat. But Big X was forged in a different fire. He let the despondency fester for a calculated period, allowing the Germans to lower their guard, to believe the Krieges were finally broken. Then, in the dead of the Polish winter of 1943, he reconvened the X-organization. In the freezing confines of Hut 104, his voice was not one of consolation, but of cold, unyielding command. Tom was a lesson, not a failure. Their security had been good, it now had to be perfect. Their engineering was brilliant, it now had to be inspired. The work on Harry would resume. But it would be different. Slower, quieter, more paranoid. The diggers were reduced to a single shift, working only at night. The dispersal of sand, now under intense scrutiny, became an art form of misdirection. The penguins were retired. Instead, the sand was stored in Dick, the abandoned tunnel, which was now laboriously hollowed out, its entrance carefully resealed after each transfer. When Dick became full, they began storing sandbags under the seats of the camp's theater, a space the Germans rarely inspected thoroughly. The theater itself became a critical tool of deception. The prisoners staged elaborate plays and boisterous musical reviews, their rehearsals and performances providing the perfect cover of noise to mask the sounds of hammering and digging from Hut 104 next door. The work was agonizingly slow, each inch of progress paid for with frayed nerves and the constant, gut-wrenching fear of a boot stomp on the floorboards above. As Harry burrowed deeper beneath the earth, its sheer length created a new set of logistical problems. The journey from the base of the entrance shaft to the tunnel face was now an expedition in itself, taking a man crawling on his belly nearly 15 minutes. Hauling out bags of sand and hauling in timber supports became an exhausting, time-consuming nightmare. The efficiency of the entire operation was grinding to a halt. The solution came from Wally Floody, the Tunnel King, and his engineers, an underground railway. Using the same wooden rails that had been so successful in Tom, they laid a track along the entire length of Harry's floor. On this track ran a small, flat trolley, pulled by a continuous rope system operated by a man at the entrance shaft. A digger could now lie flat on the trolley and be whisked to the face in under 2 minutes. More importantly, the trolley could transport 2 sandbags at a time, dramatically increasing the rate of excavation. But as the tunnel grew past the 200-foot mark, a new problem arose. A single trolley on a single track meant a traffic jam. One trolley had to return before the next could depart. To solve this, the engineers embarked on their most complex subterranean construction yet, creating 2 miniature railway stations, or passing bays. These sections, painstakingly carved out of the sandy walls, were just large enough for 2 trolleys to pass each other. The first, located about 150 feet in, was christened Piccadilly Circus. The second, further down the line, was named Leicester Square. These names, echoes of a life of freedom in a distant city, became legendary in the camp. A man would be assigned duty as the station master at Piccadilly, directing the flow of traffic with a series of tugs on the rope. The system was a triumph, a testament to their organized brilliance. It turned the dark, claustrophobic passage into a functioning transport artery, a bizarre, miniature subway system running 30 feet beneath the feet of their oblivious captors. The secret world of Harry now had its own geography, its own infrastructure, its own pulse. The X-organization's success depended on more than just engineering. It required a mastery of psychology and a thriving black market. The prisoners became expert manipulators, leveraging the boredom, greed, and occasional humanity of their guards. A select group of prisoners, known as contact men, were responsible for this dangerous trade. They identified guards who were susceptible to bribery, men who were poorly paid, disillusioned with the war, or simply had a weakness for the high-quality coffee, chocolate, and cigarettes found in Red Cross parcels. These parcels were the currency of Stalag Luft III's secret economy. A single bar of chocolate could buy a German newspaper, invaluable for its train timetables. A can of coffee might procure a camera, wire, or official stationery for the forgers. One of the most effective contact men was an American pilot, George Harsh, who cultivated relationships with several guards. Through a complex system of dead drops and coded conversations, he and his colleagues managed to acquire railway maps of Germany, official letterheads, and even a precious Luftwaffe pass that became the master template for Des Plunkett's forgery department. This network was their lifeline to the outside world, feeding the illusionists in the forgery and tailoring departments with the authentic details they needed to create new identities. Deception was a camp-wide art form. When the ferrets were on the prowl near Hut 104, the camp's German-speaking choir, led by a captured pilot, would spontaneously begin a boisterous practice session of Bach or Wagner, the powerful chorus drowning out any subterranean noise. The constant state of alert fostered a unique sense of collective responsibility. Every man in the compound, whether he was a digger, a forger, a tailor, or just a lookout, was a vital cog in Bushell's machine. They were bound together by a shared secret, a silent conspiracy that permeated every aspect of their captive lives, turning the prison camp into a stage for the greatest act of defiance they could imagine. By March 1944, after a year of relentless, clandestine labor, Harry was complete. The tunnel stretched an astonishing 336 feet from the stove in Hut 104, passing under the death strip of sterile ground, under the massive perimeter fence, and, they believed, into the relative safety of the dense pine forest that bordered the camp. The air was thick with an almost unbearable excitement. The final list of 200 escapers was drawn up, a complex mix of lottery and merit. Priority was given to those with German language skills and the best papers, the hardarsers who had the greatest chance of making a home run to England. Others were grouped into serial travelers, equipped with less convincing papers and stories, who would attempt to travel in groups by train. Bushell himself planned to pose as a French businessman. Before they could break the surface, one final, critical measurement was needed. A surveying team, using a primitive clinometer made of a protractor and a weighted string, had calculated the tunnel's length. Now they needed to confirm the exit point. On a dark, overcast night, a small probe was pushed carefully up from the tunnel face through the last few inches of soil. A scout, Lieutenant Les Long, then crawled to the end of the shaft to peer through the tiny hole. His heart sank. He scrambled back to Piccadilly Circus and sent a frantic signal. The news that filtered back to Bushell was catastrophic. The surveyor's calculations were off. The tunnel was short. Instead of emerging within the concealing darkness of the forest, the exit hole was located in the open, exposed ground, a mere 20 feet from the tree line and, horrifyingly, an almost direct line of sight of a German sentry tower. A wave of cold dread washed over the leadership. Postponement was impossible, the ground would soon thaw, making a collapse likely, and the risk of discovery grew with every passing day. Roger Bushell convened a final, tense meeting. The options were stark: abandon the entire project, or proceed against terrifying odds. His decision was swift and ruthless. They would go. The escape was set for the next moonless night, March 24th. The risk had just escalated from monumental to suicidal, but there was no turning back now. The night of Friday, March 24, 1944, descended on Stalag Luft III with a biting, sub-zero wind. A fresh layer of snow covered the ground, a pristine white blanket that would cruelly record every footprint. Inside Hut 104, the atmosphere was electric with suppressed panic and adrenaline. 200 men, dressed in their bizarre and brilliant costumes, as French laborers, Swedish businessmen, Balkan tradesmen, were crammed into the bunks, their forged papers tucked into their pockets, their hearts hammering a frantic rhythm against their ribs. Roger Bushell, calm and imperious, gave the final briefing. He reminded them of their duty, of the chaos they would sow. There would be no turning back. At 8:45 p.m., the X-Organization Security Network gave the all-clear. The lookouts were in place, the choir was on standby, and the camp's rhythm appeared deceptively normal. The heavy stove in Hut 104 was moved aside, revealing the dark, square mouth of Harry. The air pump began its rhythmic, muffled beat. The first man chosen to go was Flight Lieutenant Johnny Bull, a close associate of Bushell. Dressed as a French civilian and carrying a small cardboard suitcase, he shook a few hands, gave a tight, grim smile, and disappeared into the shaft. He was followed by the first of the clear-up crew, whose job was to dig out the final exit. The men in the hut waited in suffocating silence. Time stretched into an eternity. Nearly an hour passed. A message finally came back up the tunnel, passed from man to man. The exit hatch, a simple wooden board, was frozen solid and buried under deep snow. It was taking far longer than anticipated to cut through. Then, a more serious problem. An Allied air raid on Berlin caused the camp authorities to shut off the electrical grid, plunging the tunnel into absolute darkness. The lights, the lifeline of the operation, were dead. In the pitch black, 30 feet below the frozen ground, the escape had run into its first major crisis before a single man had even tasted the air of freedom. The sudden plunge into total darkness was a catastrophic blow. Chaos erupted in the suffocating confines of Harry. Men stumbled, cursed, and the meticulously planned schedule dissolved into confusion. The failure of the electric lights, a system they had so brazenly hijacked from their captors, was a cruel irony. Panic, the ever-present enemy, began to seep into the tunnel. But the X-Organization had planned for every contingency but this. Resourcefulness, born of long years of deprivation, took over. In the huts above, men scrambled to produce makeshift lamps. They consisted of small tins filled with mutton fat saved from their meals, with wicks made from pajama cords. These crude, smoky, foul-smelling lamps were passed down the shaft, casting a flickering, hellish orange glow onto the faces of the waiting escapers. The air, already thin, grew thick with greasy smoke, making breathing difficult and coating every surface with a layer of grime. Up at the exit, the delay was becoming critical. The man tasked with opening the way, Johnny Marshall, finally broke through the frozen crust of earth and snow. As he carefully pushed the wooden trapdoor open and poked his head out, the full horror of their miscalculation became real. The exit was terrifyingly exposed. The dark, comforting wall of the pine forest was a full 30 feet away, a 30-foot sprint across open, snow-covered ground. Worse, a sentry path lay between the exit and the trees, and the silhouette of the guard tower was starkly visible against the night sky. And to compound the nightmare, a patrol was marching along the path, his boots crunching in the snow, his route taking him directly past the gaping black hole of their exit. Marshall ducked back down, his heart pounding, signaling for the first man out, less long, to wait. The escape, scheduled to move one man every minute, had been delayed by nearly 2 hours and had not yet even begun. Above ground, in Hut 104, the waiting was an agony. The men heard the distant drone of the Berlin-bound bombers, the cause of their power cut, and the faint, rhythmic crunch of the sentries' boots, a sound that now signaled imminent doom. Despite the disastrous start, Roger Bushell's will was absolute. The escape would proceed. The first man, less long, finally emerged from the hole into the frigid night air around 10:30 p.m. A rope system had been devised. A man at the exit would tug the rope twice to signal clear and once for danger. As Long lay flat in the snow, waiting for the sentry patrol to pass, the rope remained slack. He could hear the German guard whistling as he walked his beat, agonizingly close. The signal finally came. Long scrambled to his feet, pulling his small bag, and made a desperate, crouching run for the trees. He vanished into the shadows, the first ghost to slip through the net. But the process was lethally slow. The exposed exit, the need to wait for the patrol, and the communication difficulties stretched the interval between escapers from 1 minute to 10 or more. Inside the tunnel, conditions deteriorated rapidly. The fat lamps consumed oxygen and choked the air with soot. At the halfway station, Piccadilly Circus, a trolley derailed, causing a major blockage and a further delay of 30 minutes as men worked frantically in the dark to get it back on the rails. The tunnel, their meticulously engineered pathway to freedom, was transforming into a death trap. Men began to suffer from oxygen starvation, their movements becoming sluggish, their minds clouded. Above, in Hut 104, the pressure was immense. The queue of 200 men snaked through the barracks. As the hours crawled by, it became brutally apparent that they would not get even half that number out before the morning roll call. The carefully constructed groups of serial travelers were broken up, their plans in disarray. Men who had spent months preparing for this one night saw their chance slipping away with every tick of the clock. Roger Bushell himself, Big X, finally made his move around 1 a.m., partnered with his friend Bernard Scheidhauer. Dressed as a French executive, he didn't even look back as he descended the ladder, his mind focused solely on the chaos he intended to unleash upon the Reich. As the night wore on, the escapes became a series of terrifyingly close calls. Each man emerging from the hole had to endure the same heart-stopping ritual, lying prone in the snow, waiting for the 2 tugs on the rope, then making the desperate dash for the trees. The snow, initially a pristine blanket, became a churned-up mess of footprints, a glaring advertisement of their activity. The sentry in the nearby tower remained oblivious, likely sheltering from the biting wind in the lee of his cabin. But the ground patrol was a constant menace. At one point, an escaper making his run for the woods stumbled and fell, his suitcase bursting open and spilling its contents. The guard was just turning the corner of his beat. The man froze, a perfect target in the snow. Miraculously, the guard paused to light a cigarette, his back turned, allowing the escaper precious seconds to scramble into the trees. Down below, the strain was showing. The air was becoming almost unbreathable. One man suffered a claustrophobic fit and had to be pulled back from the shaft, sobbing. Another passed out from lack of oxygen and was laid out at Piccadilly Circus to recover. But still they came. Men like Tim Whalen, the master forger, who carried a briefcase full of his most valuable blank documents and stamps, and Dick Churchill, whose sole preparation for the escape was learning the first verse of a German marching song. They were driven by a mixture of duty, desperation, and the sheer momentum of the operation. By 4 a.m., the flow of men had slowed to a trickle. The organizers in Hut 104 knew that dawn was approaching, and with it, the certainty of discovery. They had managed to get just over 70 men into the tunnel. The original, audacious goal of 200 was now a distant, impossible dream. The priority shifted from mass escape to damage control, to getting as many as possible clear before the inevitable alarm was raised. The end came with startling abruptness. At approximately 4:55 a.m. on March 25th, just as the 77th man, Flight Lieutenant Kinley, was preparing to exit, a German sentry on patrol strayed from his usual path. Perhaps he saw movement, or perhaps he was drawn by the unnaturally disturbed snow. He walked directly towards the exit hole. From the darkness, he saw a figure, the 76th escaper, Squadron Leader Bob Nelson, emerging from the ground like a phantom. The guard, utterly bewildered, raised his rifle and yelled. The man at the exit, seeing the sentry, tugged the warning signal on the rope, a single, sharp pull. But in the chaos and confusion, the man waiting inside the tunnel mistook it for the all-clear signal and began to climb out. The guard, now faced with a second man appearing from a hole in the ground, fired a shot into the air and blew his whistle frantically. The game was over. The single shot echoed across the silent compound, a gunshot signaling the death of the escape. Inside the tunnel, the warning "Alles ist kaputt," "It's all over," was passed down the line. Men scrambled back towards Hut 104, a desperate, panicked retreat through the suffocating darkness. The trolley at Piccadilly Circus jammed again, and men simply abandoned it, crawling over each other in a desperate bid to get back before the Germans stormed the hut. Those near the exit were captured immediately. Those who made it back to the hut quickly burned their forged documents in the stove, the smoke and ash of their fabricated identities rising into the dawn sky. By the time the German guards burst into Hut 104, they found dozens of men in various states of dress, feigning sleep in their bunks, the air thick with the smell of smoke and adrenaline. The entrance to Harry was wide open, a gaping wound revealing the secret they had guarded for a year. In total, 76 men had made it out. 3 would make it to freedom. The rest were now scattered across the Third Reich, fugitives in a hostile land. For the 76 who escaped, the brief taste of freedom was intoxicating but perilous. They fanned out from the woods around Sagan, each man a lonely fugitive armed with a desperate plan. The hardarsers, like Roger Bushell, made for the local railway station. Posing as a French businessman, Bushell and his partner, Bernard Skythauer, managed to board a train heading towards the Czechoslovakian border. Their papers were good, their German plausible. They passed through the first few inspections with nerve-wracking ease. Others, like the Norwegian pilots Per Bergsland and Jens Muller, enacted a bolder plan. Dressed as foreign workers, they made their way to a different station and boarded a train heading north, towards the Baltic coast. Their goal was the port of Stettin, where they hoped to find a neutral Swedish ship. A third pair, Dutch pilot Bram van der Stok, utilized his flawless German and confident demeanor to travel as a Dutch electrical worker. He moved with an air of authority that deflected suspicion, boarding train after train, heading west towards his native Holland. But the Reich was waking up. The discovery of the escape at Sagan triggered a response of unprecedented fury. The news reached the highest levels of the Nazi regime with lightning speed. When Adolf Hitler was informed, he flew into a volcanic rage. He screamed that every single recaptured officer was to be shot on sight. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, argued that shooting Allied airmen would invite devastating reprisals. A furious negotiation ensued between Göring, Himmler, and Keitel. Himmler, head of the SS and Gestapo, wanted blood. The final, chilling order was issued directly from Hitler. A majority of the recaptured men were to be handed over to the Gestapo and executed. A list of 50 names was to be drawn up. The massive manhunt, the Grossfahndung, was initiated. The entire country was put on alert. Police, SS, Gestapo, Hitler Youth, and the Home Guard were all mobilized. The faces of the escapers were plastered on posters in every town and railway station. For the 73 men still at large, Germany had just become the biggest prison camp in the world. The dragnet thrown across the Reich was terrifyingly effective. For most of the escapers, freedom was heartbreakingly brief. The brutal winter weather, combined with the nationwide alert, made travel nearly impossible for those on foot. Many were exhausted, frostbitten, and starving within days. They were picked up by local police, the Volkssturm, People's Militia, or even sharp-eyed civilians. James Cattenack and Arnold Christensen, two Australian pilots, managed to travel over 200 miles by train before a suspicious ticket collector at Flensburg, near the Danish border, betrayed them. Others were caught through simple bad luck. 2 men were discovered sleeping in a barn by a farmer's boy. Several were apprehended at train station checkpoints, their forged papers, so painstakingly created, wilting under the scrutiny of expert Gestapo agents. Roger Bushell, Big X himself, and his partner Bernard Scheidhauer made it as far as Saarbrücken, on the very doorstep of the French border. They were waiting for a train on the station platform, freedom almost within their grasp, when a Gestapo agent, his suspicion aroused by their foreign appearance, approached them for a routine document check. The papers held up, but a follow-up question in German exposed a slight hesitation, a flicker of uncertainty in their accent. It was enough. They were arrested and their identities soon confirmed. As the prisoners were rounded up, they were initially held in local jails, believing the worst they faced was a return to Sagan and a stint in solitary confinement. They were wrong. The teletypes from Berlin had already delivered their fate. Under a secret directive known as the Sagan Befehl, Sagan Order, the captured airmen were to be transferred into the custody of the Gestapo. This was a flagrant violation of the Geneva Convention. They were being taken from the jurisdiction of the Luftwaffe, which afforded them the rights of prisoners of war, and handed over to Himmler's executioners. One by one, or in small groups, the recaptured men were taken from their cells, told they were being driven back to Stalag Luft III, and loaded into unmarked cars. The murders were clinical, cowardly, and brutal. They were carried out across Germany between March 29 and April 13, 1944. The Gestapo agents followed a chillingly simple script. The captured airmen would be driven along a quiet country road, typically near cities like Breslau, Zittau, or Görlitz. The car would pull over, ostensibly for the prisoners to relieve themselves. As the officers got out and walked towards the side of the road, they were shot in the back of the head. The official reports were then falsified, claiming the men had been shot while trying to escape or had been killed resisting arrest. Roger Bushell and Bernard Scheidhauer were murdered on March 29 near Ramstein. They were driven from their cells in Saarbrücken and shot by members of the Saarbrücken Gestapo, under the direct supervision of a senior officer named Dr. Leopold Spann. Their bodies were cremated at the Saarbrücken crematorium. Squadron Leader Les Broderick and Flight Lieutenant Dennis Street were taken from a jail in Görlitz and murdered in the same fashion. Flight Lieutenants Tony Hayter and Tommy Thompson were shot near the Czech border. The killing machine was efficient and decentralized, carried out by different Gestapo Kripo, criminal police, units to spread the responsibility and maintain secrecy. The selection of the 50 men to be executed was largely arbitrary. SS General Arthur Northeast by East, head of the Kripo, later claimed he tried to save the well-known names, but the final list was a cruel lottery of fate. A mix of the most valued members of the X-organization and men who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The news of the deaths trickled back to Stalag Luft III in the most callous way imaginable. The camp commandant, von Lindner Wildaw, who had maintained a professional soldier's respect for the prisoners, was shattered. He was summoned to Berlin, berated for his incompetence, and relieved of his command, soon to be court-martialed. His replacement, a hardened Nazi official, coldly informed the senior British officer that the urns containing the ashes of 50 of his comrades would be returned to the camp. The announcement was met with stunned silence, then a wave of pure, cold rage. The Great Escape had turned into the Great Murder. Amidst the overwhelming tragedy, there were three astonishing stories of success. Per Bergsland and Jens Muller, the two Norwegian pilots, successfully executed their plan to reach Sweden. After their escape, they made their way north by train to the port city of Stettin. Moving with confidence through the bustling port, they managed to locate a Swedish freighter, the MS Gdynia. After a tense period hiding on the docks, they found a sympathetic sailor who agreed to smuggle them aboard. They were hidden in a tiny, filthy locker in the ship's hold. For 3 days, they endured the cramped, suffocating space, listening to the sounds of German harbor patrols conducting searches. Finally, on March 30th, the ship weighed anchor. They could feel the gentle roll as it entered the open waters of the Baltic Sea. When they were finally let out of their hiding place, they were in neutral Swedish waters, truly free. They were taken to England, where they were able to provide the British authorities with the first, horrifying confirmation that the Germans were executing recaptured prisoners. The third and most famous success story was that of Dutch pilot Bram van der Stok. A man of incredible nerve and resourcefulness, he traveled alone, moving westwards across Germany and Holland by train. He posed as a Dutch factory worker, speaking flawless German and Dutch, and even brazenly shared a train compartment with several German officers. He made his way through Utrecht to Maastricht, where he connected with the Dutch resistance. They guided him across the border into Belgium, then through France, and finally over the Pyrenees Mountains into neutral Spain. His journey was a solo odyssey of over 1,000 miles through enemy territory. From Spain, he made his way to the British consulate in Gibraltar and was flown back to England on July 11, 1944. He immediately rejoined the RAF and flew combat missions over Europe, a free man fighting a war he had so dramatically refused to sit out. Their success was a beacon of hope in the darkness, proof that Bushell's vision, while costly, was not impossible. When the war ended in May 1945, the story of the Great Escape and the subsequent murders was not forgotten. The Allied nations were determined to bring those responsible to justice. The task was led by a special investigation branch of the RAF police, headed by Squadron Leader Frank McKenna. Their investigation was as meticulous and determined as the escape itself. Working from the list of the 50 murdered men and the fragmented accounts of survivors, McKenna and his team fanned out across a defeated Germany. It was a grim and difficult task. Gestapo records had been destroyed, witnesses had disappeared, and many of the killers had gone to ground, melting back into the civilian population. McKenna's team operated like detectives, piecing together clues, interviewing former Gestapo members, and tracking down suspects. They exhumed bodies from unmarked graves to perform autopsies, which invariably proved the shot while escaping narrative to be a lie, confirming the men had been executed at close range from behind. Their big break came with the capture of SS General Arthur Northeast by East, who had compiled the execution list. Before his own execution for his role in the July 20th plot to kill Hitler, Northeast by East provided crucial details about the Sagan Befehl and the chain of command. The investigation led directly to the regional Gestapo offices responsible for carrying out the murders. Dr. Leopold Spann, the man who oversaw Bushell's murder, was tracked down and arrested. One by one, the net closed around the others. The hunt was relentless, spanning nearly 2 years. Of the estimated 72 individuals directly involved in the 50 murders, from the high-ranking officers who gave the orders to the drivers and triggermen, McKenna's team successfully identified and brought charges against a significant number. It was a promise kept to the men of Hut 104, a final act of duty to honor the 50 who had been so savagely denied the protections of war. The trial of the Sagan murderers convened in Hamburg in July 1947. It was one of the largest war crimes trials held by the British military. 18 former Gestapo and security police officials stood in the dock, facing charges for the murder of Allied prisoners of war. The evidence presented by the prosecution was overwhelming. The court heard testimony from RAF investigators, German witnesses, and the few who had been present at the arrests and then spared. The chilling bureaucratic trail of the Sagan Buffel was laid bare, exposing the cold-blooded nature of the Nazi state, where murder could be ordered by memo and carried out as a matter of administrative duty. The defendants offered feeble excuses. They were only following orders. Befehl ist Befehl, a defense that had already been rejected at the Nuremberg trials. After a grueling trial, the verdicts were delivered. Of the 18 men in the dock, 14 were found guilty. 13 of them were sentenced to death by hanging. The sentences were carried out in February 1948. Other culprits were tried in different courts. Some committed suicide before capture, while a few, like the overall head of the Gestapo, Heinrich Müller, vanished and were never brought to justice. Today, at the site of Stalag Luft III in Żagań, Poland, a memorial tunnel and a stone monument stand as a solemn tribute. They mark the beginning of Harry and list the names of the 50 men who paid the ultimate price for their audacity. The Great Escape was not a story of victory in the traditional sense. It was a story of the indomitable human spirit. It was a testament to Roger Bushell's belief that it was the duty of every officer to harass the enemy, a duty that did not end with capture. The 76 men who crawled through Harry did not break the Reich, but they embodied a spirit of defiance that could not be extinguished by barbed wire, isolation, or the threat of death. Their courage, their ingenuity, and their sacrifice became a powerful and enduring legend of the Second World War.